I'm sure all of us have used the phrase at one time or another that that person thinks they are God. Welcome to one of our blogs from St. Mark's Episcopal in Dalton, Georgia, and all of you join us on Facebook and YouTube. Glad to have you here today. That's a very familiar phrase. That person thinks they're God. And today I was reminded by somebody who's one of my favorite writers. He's a fellow named Daniel Richards, who is the relatively new bishop of the Episcopal Church in Upper State, South Carolina. And I get his email every week, and he wrote this week many things, but part of it was he used that phrase about that person thinks they're God. And he brought up the point. He says that when we say that, we don't mean that that person wants what's best for everybody, and that person is giving a lot of forgiveness or mercy or peace or grace or whatever. It's really sort of an insult. That means that person is egotistical or believes they are more highly of themselves and their control and their power or their status. And a person usually who's easily offended, that's the person who thinks they're God. And Bishop Richards makes the point of is that if we think that's God is this person who is egotistical and has control and power problems, then maybe we need a lot more Jesus, because we certainly have the wrong image of God in Bishop Richard's eyes on that. So that story reminded me of another story I read this week by another Daniel Johnson, who is a Christian music critic or historian, who wrote another story about a hymn that was written 250 years ago that I want to speak about, that talks about this image of God. But the writer of this hymn, the person who wrote the lyrics from it, was someone who lived around 1700. They were a seafarer, as was their father. They were really not a nice person. They were sort of a jerk. Nobody liked them. They had no conscience. They were very mistreated everyone. Made their living for a while as a slave trader on the ships or whatever. But this person was so unpopular among even the other crew members and co-workers that they actually marooned him on an island in West Africa. They put him on off the ship, and he had to work doing manual labor, literally as a slave. And finally he got his father to send some money to rescue him from this. But he, going back, realized what a wretched person he was, and that he needed to change himself drastically. So he did, and drastically he did change himself. He became an evangelical Anglican minister, and evangelical Anglicans were around in those days, particularly in rural England. So he became the pastor of a small church in rural England, and but he had another hobby. He liked to write. He was capable of writing hymns and wrote some pretty good ones, but he never really considered himself as a great songwriter. He would write hymns, and the purpose was that people would sing these hymns after his sermons, and what it would do is sort of reinforce the point of the sermons, or just make his point for him by singing hymns. It's probably a pretty good idea. Well, in January of 1723, he had a sermon on 1 Chronicles, the 17th chapter, the 16th and 17th verse. You probably aren't familiar with 1 Chronicles. We don't read that very often. We don't hear sermons about it very often. But this person gave one. And what the story of the time is this is when the prophet Nathan is telling David that God is not going to allow him to build the temple in Jerusalem, that God has chosen that one of his descendants would do that. And it turns out that Solomon is the one who does this. But David is able to accept this, and David in these verses is praising God for God's grace, and because God has given him a covenant that David would be the heir to the ancestor of a kingdom that would last for generations. So these verses are about David praising God's grace and speaking of God's grace. The name of the hymn that he wrote was called Faith, Review, and Expectations. Well, it was not a very popular hymn. In fact, it really didn't get much play. It was used by 20 different tunes or music that went along with it. Till finally, 1835, many years later, a fellow named William Walker over in England attached it to a music to a song called music called New Britain. And this kind of caught on for a while, but never really made it in England. In fact, it pretty well disappeared in England, but it became popular in America because the tune and the lyrics really resonated with people, the revivals that were going on in America in the early 1800s. And then it became very popular because Harriet Beecher Stowe actually used the hymn in her very popular and very influential novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. And she actually added a verse to it from another hymn called Jerusalem, and used it in the book, and it became sort of the theme song for the abolitionist movement at that time, right before the Civil War. Later in the 1800s, it was used in a lot of revivals, and even used by D.L. Moody in the many very popular revivals that he had during the time. Today, and in fact, it became so popular that early 20th century, it was included in 14 different hymnals for different denominations. So it's one of the more popular songs and continues that way today. So today, the writer of that song was a fellow named John Newton. And today we don't know it as from its original title. We know it from its title, Amazing Grace. It has been recorded over 200 times by people as diverse as Johnny Cash and Aretha Franklin, who had a very famous rendition of it. It's been quoted in eulogies by George Walker Bush, and Barack Obama. It's really one of everyone's favorite hymns. So everybody knows Amazing Grace. And Mr. Johnson was writing what makes it so popular. Now, why has it resonated across so many different cultures? Well, what Mr. Johnson suggests is that each of us can identify with the story. That all of us, every one of us at points in our lives are hurting. And we feel like wretched sinners, as Mr. Newton did at that time in his life. But all of us, every one of us, can be lifted up by God's grace. There's a God has enough of his amazing grace for everyone. So I would suggest as a lesson for this vlog is that we're tempted to insult God by saying that some person thinks they are God when it's somebody who's really not like God at all, that instead we will remember what God is really like. That really we worship a God that offers all of us, even each one of us, his amazing grace. And remember, it is our duty as Christians to bear God's image to the world. So, thanks be to God. Alleluia, alleluia, alleluia.